When the king's feral son bared his fangs at the lowest woman in the room, the marble hall plunged into a dead silence. Elite warriors instinctively reached for their weapons, bracing for an imminent bloodbath. Instead, the rejected, scarred Omega simply sank to her knees, exposed her throat, and waited for the bite. The worst part about being a rejected Omega wasn't the physical pain of the severed mate bond, though that had felt like someone taking a jagged piece of glass to her ribs. The worst part was the sheer, crushing mundanity of life afterward. Her name was Jewel Hayes. 2 years ago, she was meant to be the Luna of the Crescent Ridge Pack. Now, she was scrubbing a stubborn stain off a porcelain serving platter in the chaotic, steam-filled kitchen of the pack's main estate. "Jewel, stop daydreaming and get those trays out to the terrace," barked Chef Henri, a stressed, red-faced human who knew nothing about werewolves but knew everything about catering a 5-star event. He shoved a heavy silver tray loaded with smoked salmon canapés into her hands. Jewel adjusted the collar of her stiff, cheap polyester uniform. It was an itchy black thing that smelled faintly of industrial laundry detergent, a sharp contrast to the bespoke Brioni suits and silk Valentino gowns currently floating around the grand ballroom. She lived in a damp, one-bedroom apartment over a noisy hardware store across the state line in Spokane, Washington. She drove a battered 2004 Honda Civic with a dying alternator. She was only here, back in the very pack house where her life was destroyed, because she was trapped in a financial stranglehold. When Amory Montgomery, the alpha of Crescent Ridge and her fated mate, rejected her, he didn't just break her heart, he treated it like a corporate downsizing. He cited her weak Omega lineage as a liability to his political ambitions. He wanted a warrior Luna, someone who looked good on the arm of an alpha expanding into real estate and tech in the Pacific Northwest. He found that in Chloe, a high-ranking Delta female with a trust fund and a sneer. When Jewel was cast out, she was hit with a mountain of pack dues and broken contract fees. Until she paid off the $60,000 debt, she was legally bound to work the pack's catering events, a ghost haunting her own funeral. She pushed through the swinging kitchen doors, the heavy scent of expensive perfumes, aged scotch, and the underlying musky scent of wolf hitting her like a wall. The ballroom of the estate was dazzling, dripping with crystal chandeliers and overflowing with white orchids. Tonight wasn't just a regular pack gathering. Tonight, Amory was hosting Dominic Blackwood. Even in the fringes of werewolf society, wolves heard the whispers about the Alpha King. He controlled the entire Northern Syndicate, from the dense forests of British Columbia down through Oregon. He wasn't a politician like Amory. He was a warlord in a tailored suit. 3 years ago, rogue wolves ambushed his motorcade outside of Seattle. His mate, the Queen, was killed. Dominic had survived, and he had spent the next year systematically wiping the rogue factions off the map. But the rumors said the attack left a different kind of casualty. The king's son, Leo. He had been in the car during the ambush. Now 4 years old, the pup was entirely nonverbal, deeply traumatized, and dangerously feral. He shifted unpredictably and attacked anyone who came near him. The king was desperate, cycling through specialized handlers, doctors, and elite nannies, all of whom ended up terrified, bleeding, or quitting. Jewel kept her head down, weaving through the crowd. Her flat black shoes made no sound on the imported Italian marble. She functioned perfectly as a piece of furniture invisible. "Make sure the king's glass is never empty," she heard Amory's voice before she saw him. Jewel stiffened, a phantom ache blooming in her chest. Amory was standing near the grand staircase, looking every inch the modern alpha in a tailored navy suit. Chloe was clinging to his bicep, wearing a blood-red silk gown that left little to the imagination, her fingers glittering with the diamonds that should have been hers. "Amory, darling, do you really think bringing the king's feral brat was a good idea?" Chloe murmured, sipping her champagne. "I heard he bit an alpha in Portland last week." "Keep your voice down, Chloe," Amory hissed, his eyes darting around. "If I secure the logging contracts with Blackwood tonight, Crescent Ridge becomes the richest pack in the state. I don't care if the kid turns into a rabid dog and chews on the furniture. We accommodate him." Jewel bit the inside of her cheek to keep from scoffing. Amory always cared more about his portfolio than his people. She turned away, eager to disappear into the far corners of the room, when the heavy oak doors at the front of the hall slammed open. The temperature in the room instantly plummeted. The chatter died, replaced by a suffocating heavy silence. The sheer, overwhelming pressure of a supreme alpha's aura rolled into the room like a physical shockwave. Some of the weaker wolves in the room actually stumbled, their knees buckling under the instinctual urge to submit. Even as an Omega, Jewel's chest tightened, her lungs struggling to pull in air. Dominic Blackwood had arrived. He was terrifyingly beautiful. Standing at 6'4", the Alpha King didn't wear a tuxedo. He wore a stark black dress shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, and dark trousers. There were faint, silver scars visible on his neck, souvenirs from the ambush that took his mate. His eyes were a piercing, icy gray, scanning the room with the detached, lethal calculation of a predator assessing a trap. He smelled of dark cedar, petrichor, and cold, hard steel. Behind him stood a wall of heavily armed enforcers, but Jewel's eyes were immediately drawn to the small figure at the king's side. Leo. The little boy was a heartbreaking sight. He was tiny for a 4-year-old wolf, dressed in a soft, oversized gray sweater. He had messy dark hair that fell over his eyes, but it was his posture that struck her. He was rigidly hunched, his small hands curled into tight fists, his amber eyes darting frantically around the crowded ballroom. He was vibrating with sheer, unadulterated panic. The sensory overload of the room, the clinking glasses, the heavy perfumes, the aggressive sense of 200 ambitious wolves was crushing him. "King Blackwood," Amory boomed, stepping forward with a wide, practiced politician's smile. He forced himself to stand tall against the king's crushing aura. "Welcome to Crescent Ridge. We are deeply honored." Dominic didn't smile. He merely gave a stiff, single nod. "Montgomery," Amory gestured grandly toward the main hall. "Please, we have prepared our finest suites for you, and a private dining area if you prefer to." It happened in a fraction of a second. A waiter, terrified by the king's presence, backed up too quickly. His elbow clipped a towering stack of crystal champagne flutes on a nearby table. Crash. The shattering glass echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Leo shrieked. It wasn't a human cry. It was the high-pitched, desperate yelp of a cornered pup. In a blink, the boy dropped to all fours. Bone cracked and shifted with sickening speed as the child lost control of his human form. Gasps ripped through the crowd. Guests scrambled backward, tripping over each other in their expensive shoes. Where a little boy had been standing, there was now a half-shifted wolf pup. He was a chaotic mix of dark fur and human skin, his claws fully extended, tearing into the antique Persian rug. He backed himself into the corner near the catering tables, right near where Jewel was standing. "Stand back!" Dominic roared, his voice shaking the crystal chandeliers above. He stepped toward his son, his hands raised. "Leo, Cub, it's me, it's Dad, it's okay." But Leo was too far gone. Blinded by PTSD, he bared his sharp little fangs and snapped wildly at the air, issuing a guttural, warning growl that sent shivers down Jewel's spine. The pup didn't recognize his father. He was trapped in his own personal nightmare, seeing threats everywhere. Amory, ever the arrogant fool, saw an opportunity to show off his leadership in front of the king. "Allow me, Your Majesty," Amory said, stepping past Dominic. His chest was puffed out, his eyes flashing a dominant alpha gold. "A rogue pup needs a firm hand, not coddling." "Montgomery, step away from my son immediately," Dominic snarled, his voice deadly low. But Amory ignored the warning. He marched right up to the terrified, growling child and unleashed his alpha command. It was a wave of oppressive, heavy domination meant to force a weaker wolf to the ground. "Submit, pup," Amory shouted, his voice laced with power. It was the worst thing he could have possibly done. Instead of submitting, Leo's survival instincts kicked into overdrive. Driven mad by the aggressive command, the pup lunged. His jaws clamped down hard on Amory's tailored pant leg, his sharp teeth sinking deep into Amory's calf. Amory screamed in shock and pain. "Get this rabid little bastard off me!" Instinctively, Amory raised his hand to strike the child. Dominic moved so fast he was a blur. The king slammed Amory against a marble pillar, one hand wrapped around Amory's throat, lifting the Crescent Ridge Alpha off his feet. Amory gasped for air, his face turning purple, while Chloe shrieked in terror from the sidelines. Meanwhile, Leo was spiraling. Having tasted blood, the half-shifted pup scrambled backward, terrified, vibrating with feral aggression. He was backed against the wall, trapped, growling at the elite warriors who were drawing their weapons, unsure of how to subdue the king's son without hurting him. The room was frozen in a standoff of impending tragedy. Jewel didn't think. She couldn't. Her Omega instincts, buried under 2 years of rejection, bleach, and sorrow, suddenly roared to life. Her inner wolf wept for the terrified child. He wasn't a monster. He was a baby, drowning in fear, needing an anchor. She dropped her silver tray. It clattered to the floor, drawing a few panicked eyes, but she ignored them. She stepped out from the shadows of the catering line. "Hey," a guard hissed, grabbing her arm. "Caterer, get back!" Jewel yanked her arm away with surprising strength. She walked slowly into the clearing, right into the center of the danger zone. "What is that Omega doing?" someone whispered loudly. "She's going to get herself killed," Chloe scoffed, though her voice shook. Leo saw her approaching, his hackles raised, his fur bristling defensively. He let out a vicious, ragged growl, his amber eyes locking onto hers, his muzzle wrinkled as he bared his blood-stained fangs at her. He was warning her. One more step, and he would tear her apart. She didn't stop, but she didn't walk tall. 3 feet away from him, right in the center of the silent, breath-holding ballroom, Jewel dropped to her knees. The marble was cold through her cheap polyester pants. She kept her movements slow, deliberate, and entirely non-threatening. She didn't project command. She didn't project fear. She opened the tight seal on her scent, letting the pure, calming aroma of rain-washed lavender and warm vanilla flood the immediate area. It was her natural scent, unmasked by the harsh detergents. Leo stopped snapping, his nose twitching. She kept her hands flat on her thighs. Slowly, deliberately, she tilted her head to the side, exposing the vulnerable, unmarked skin of her throat. It was the ultimate gesture of submission and trust in their kind. She was telling him, "I am no threat. I am yours to judge." "Hi, sweet boy," Jewel whispered, her voice barely carrying over the deafening silence of the room. "It's so loud in here, isn't it? It's okay. You're safe." Leo growled again, a low rumble in his chest, and took a hesitant step forward. He sniffed the air, leaning toward her exposed neck. Jewel heard the collective gasp of the room. She felt the heavy, burning stare of Dominic Blackwood boring into the side of her head, having dropped Amory to the floor to watch her. She knew that if Leo bit her right now, he could easily rip out her jugular. She closed her eyes and waited. She felt his hot breath on her skin. Then, the sharp prick of a tiny claw resting against her collarbone, but the bite never came. Instead, a soft whine broke the silence. The tension in the small body evaporated. Jewel opened her eyes just as Leo's half-shifted form melted away, returning to that of a little boy in a gray sweater. Tears were streaming down his face. Without making a sound, Leo climbed forward, crawling directly into her lap. He wrapped his small arms tightly around her neck and buried his face in her shoulder, shivering uncontrollably. A collective breath was exhaled across the ballroom. Amory, rubbing his throat on the floor, stared at her in dumbfounded horror. Jewel wrapped her arms around the boy, rubbing his back soothingly, rocking him gently on the cold marble floor. "I've got you," she murmured into his hair. When she looked up, she locked eyes with Dominic Blackwood. The king wasn't looking at her like a caterer. He wasn't looking at her like a rejected Omega. His icy gray eyes were blazing with something dark, possessive, and entirely terrifying. And for the first time in 2 years, the dead space in her chest where her mate bond used to be sparked. The ballroom remained suspended in a breathless vacuum. Jewel kept her eyes focused on the little boy weeping quietly into her collarbone, his tiny fingers twisted tightly into the cheap polyester of her uniform. His scent, a sharp, frightened mixture of damp earth and ozone, was slowly shifting into something softer, like warm milk and rain. Then, the heavy, measured sound of footsteps approached. Dominic Blackwood stopped just inches from where Jewel knelt. Up close, his presence was even more suffocating. He crouched down, his movements slow and deliberate so as not to spook the pup. When he was at eye level with her, the sheer intensity of his icy gray eyes nearly made her flinch. "Leo," Dominic rumbled, his voice devoid of the terrifying alpha command he had used earlier. It was thick with a desperate, paternal exhaustion. Leo peeked out from the crook of her neck, let out a soft whine, and then, miraculously, reached one arm out to his father while keeping the other anchored around her neck. Dominic closed his eyes, a flicker of profound relief washing over his scarred features. He pressed his large hand against the back of his son's head, exhaling a shaky breath. "Thank you," the Alpha King whispered. The words meant only for her. Before Jewel could respond, the spell was broken by the sound of Amory scrambling to his feet, coughing and rubbing his bruised throat. The Crescent Ridge Alpha couldn't stand the sight of a rejected Omega stealing the spotlight, especially not in front of the most powerful man in the Northern Syndicate. "Your Majesty," Amory rasped, his voice dripping with forced authority. "I apologize for this disruption. Jewel, get your hands off the king's son and get back to the kitchen. You're embarrassing the pack." Jewel stiffened, the old habits of submission kicking in. She gently tried to pry Leo's arms from her neck, but the child immediately whimpered, his eyes flashing amber as he began to growl again, burying his face deeper into her chest. Dominic's head snapped up. The vulnerability vanished, replaced instantly by the lethal warlord. He stood to his full height, turning his back to her and shielding Jewel and his son from Amory's view. "If you speak to her in that tone again, Montgomery," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a deadly, quiet register that carried through the silent room, "I will rip your tongue from your mouth and feed it to the crows." Amory paled, taking a stumbling step back. Chloe, standing near the overturned champagne tower, covered her mouth in horror. She is just a disgraced Omega, Your Majesty," Amory stammered, trying to save face in front of his whispering pack members. "She was rejected for weak bloodlines. She's unstable. The only unstable thing in this room is your pathetic excuse for leadership," Dominic countered, stepping forward and forcing Amory to submit his gaze to the floor. "Your arrogance nearly got my son killed, and it nearly cost you your life. This woman," he gestured behind him without looking, "did what a dozen highly trained handlers and doctors at the Mayo Clinic couldn't do. She saved him." Dominic turned back to Jewel, extending a large, calloused hand. She stared at it for a second before shifting Leo's weight to one hip and placing her hand in his. A jolt of electricity shot up her arm the moment their skin made contact. The dead, hollow space in her chest, the graveyard of her severed mate bond, suddenly flared with a bright, terrifying heat. Dominic's breath hitched, his eyes dilated, the irises swallowing the gray until they were almost entirely black. Mate. The word wasn't spoken, but it echoed between them with deafening clarity. A second-chance mate bond was incredibly rare, a myth whispered about by elders. Yet, here it was, binding a king to a dishwasher. "What is your name?" Dominic asked, his voice suddenly thick. "Jewel," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Jewel Hayes." "Jewel," he tasted the name, his thumb gently brushing her knuckles. "You are coming with me to my estate in Snoqualmie. My son needs you, and I will compensate you handsomely for your time." "She can't leave," Amory shouted, his greed overriding his survival instincts. "She signed a legally binding indentured contract with Crescent Ridge. She owes the pack $60,000 in broken betrothal fees and pack dues. Under syndicate law, she cannot cross state lines until the debt is cleared." Dominic didn't even blink. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a sleek black checkbook from Cascadian Wealth Management, a private bank reserved for the ultra-elite. He uncapped a Mont Blanc pen, scribbled a figure, and tore the check free. He didn't hand it to Amory. He let it flutter to the marble floor at Amory's feet. "There is $100,000, Dominic said coldly. "Consider her debt bought, and your logging contract denied. If you or anyone from Crescent Ridge ever contacts Jewel again, I will return to this estate, and I will burn it to the foundation." He placed a protective hand on the small of her back. "We're leaving," he announced to his guards. As they walked out of the grand double doors, leaving a stunned, humiliated Amory in their wake, Jewel looked down at the little boy sleeping peacefully against her chest. For the first time in 2 years, the scent of bleach and despair was gone, replaced by the crisp, powerful scent of cedar and the promise of a future. The Blackwood estate in the Snoqualmie Valley was less of a house and more of a modern fortress built into the side of the Cascade Mountains. It was constructed of dark timber, glass, and raw stone, surrounded by miles of heavily patrolled ancient pine forests. For the first 3 days, Jewel didn't leave Leo's side. He refused to let her out of his sight. They slept in the king's private wing, in a massive bedroom overlooking the misty valley. The feral, violent pup that had terrorized the Northern Syndicate had vanished, replaced by a quiet, deeply traumatized little boy who just needed an anchor. She read him stories, she fed him, and slowly, the terrified amber in his eyes began to settle back into a soft, human brown. On the 4th morning, Dominic called Jewel into his private study. The room smelled intoxicatingly of his cedar and petrichor scent. Sitting across from Dominic at a massive oak desk was a human man in a sharp suit, pushing a pair of wire-rimmed glasses up his nose. "Jewel, this is Dr. Thomas Abernathy." Dominic said softly, gesturing for her to sit in the plush leather chair beside him. He is a leading geneticist from a private lycanthrope research division out of Chicago. I asked him to look into your medical history. Jewel's stomach dropped. My history? Amory already broadcasted it. I have weak omega blood. I'm a genetic dead end. That's why he rejected me. Dr. Abernathy offered a sad, professional smile. Miss Hayes, Amory Montgomery is many things, but a medical professional is not one of them. We accessed your original blood panels from before your rejection. The records Amory submitted to the Syndicate Council were completely falsified. Jewel stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. Falsified? Dominic leaned forward, his jaw tight with barely contained rage. Amory bribed the pack physician, Dr. Albert Finch, to alter your charts, Jewel. He needed a legal loophole to break your fated bond without facing the Council's wrath, so he could marry a Delta with a massive tech trust fund. Dr. Abernathy turned his laptop toward her. It displayed complex genetic markers that she didn't understand. You don't have weak blood, Jewel. You carry a dormant recessive gene known as the aura of the hearth. It is an ancient, incredibly rare omega lineage. Your scent and your presence naturally act as a neurological sedative to traumatized wolves. That is why Leo calmed down the second you opened your scent to him. You are, quite literally, a living cure for his PTSD. The room spun. The years of scrubbing floors, the endless insults, the agonizing belief that she was worthless, defective, a mistake of the moon goddess, it was all a lie. She had been tortured for profit. Tears spilled over her lashes, hot and fast. She buried her face in her hands, a ragged sob tearing from her throat. 2 years of stolen life crashed down on her. Suddenly, Dominic was there. He knelt beside her chair, pulling her hands away from her face. His large, rough thumbs gently wiped away her tears. Dr. Abernathy quietly gathered his laptop and slipped out of the room, closing the heavy mahogany door behind him. He stole my life, Jewel wept, gripping Dominic's forearms. He broke my mind, Dominic. He made me believe I was nothing. You are everything, Dominic growled fiercely, his voice vibrating with the power of his wolf. You are the mother my son has desperately needed, and you are the mate I thought I had lost forever in that ambush. The bond we felt in that ballroom. I know you felt it too. She looked up into his icy gray eyes, finding nothing but absolute devotion and a terrifyingly protective rage meant only for those who had hurt her. I felt it, she admitted, her voice a broken whisper. But I'm broken, Dominic. I'm scarred. Then we will heal together, he vowed, pressing a soft, reverent kiss to her forehead. But first, I am going to correct an injustice. The drama didn't end there. 2 weeks later, Amory, desperate and facing financial ruin after Dominic blacklisted Crescent Ridge from every major trade route in the Northwest, attempted a fatal miscalculation. He showed up at the gates of the Blackwood estate with his enforcers, waving a dusty piece of syndicate legislation. He claimed that because her original pack dues were tied to a fraudulent betrothal contract, the buyout was void, and she was technically a rogue who needed to be extradited back to his territory for re-evaluation. Dominic didn't send his guards to handle it. He walked out to the iron gates himself, and he brought Jewel with him, her hand securely held in his. Standing in the freezing Washington rain, Amory looked pathetic, desperate to reclaim the asset he now realized he had thrown away. You're harboring a pack fugitive, Blackwood, Amory shouted over the pouring rain, though his enforcers looked terrified of the heavily armed snipers positioned on the estate walls. Hand over the Omega, or I take this to the High Council. Dominic laughed. It was a dark, hollow sound that echoed off the mountains. I already took it to the council, Montgomery, Dominic said coldly. He pulled a rolled, wax-sealed parchment from his coat. Dr. Finch confessed to the medical fraud. The council has officially stripped you of your alpha title, frozen all Crescent Ridge assets, and issued a warrant for your arrest for the endangerment and abuse of a rare-blooded Omega. Amory's face drained of all color. The enforcers behind him, realizing their alpha was now a wanted criminal, immediately backed away, lowering their weapons and submitting their necks to the king. No, Amory breathed, falling to his knees in the mud. No, wait, Jewel, tell him. We were mates. You loved me. Jewel looked down at the man who had destroyed her life, who had made her scrub floors while he drank champagne. She felt the comforting, massive presence of Dominic beside her, and she thought of Leo, safely tucked away in his playroom, drawing pictures instead of growling at shadows. You rejected a dishwasher, Amory, Jewel said, her voice steady, carrying over the rain. "But you are kneeling before a queen. Get off my land." Dominic's enforcers moved in, dragging a screaming Amory away into the storm, destined for the Syndicate's subterranean cells. Dominic wrapped his heavy wool coat around her shoulders, shielding her from the rain, and pulled her flush against his chest. "Let's go inside. My Luna," he murmured, his lips brushing her ear. "Our son is waiting." The scent of bleach was finally a distant memory, replaced by the warmth of cedar and rain. Jewel Hayes walked into the Crescent Ridge estate, an indentured servant, but she left as the fated Luna of the Northern Syndicate. Through the purest act of vulnerability, she saved a feral child and healed a broken king. Sometimes, the most powerful force in the werewolf world isn't an alpha's command, but an omega's unconditional love.